So welcome everybody. Tonight, it's I think we're going to have a really interesting talk tonight by Professor Terry Gurbish. Now, I don't think for many of you I need to introduce Terry. Terry has been, well, what can we say about Terry? Terry started his PhD. Oh, I did his PhD and completed it in 1967 at the LSE. Moved to East Anglia, UEA, University of East Anglia, and then to the LSE, where from 1989 to 2014, he was director of the LSE Business History Unit. He's published on a host of things, written a book on Mark Hewish, 2 volumes of the authorised history of British Rail, history of the Strategic Rail Authority, and with Richard Wilson wrote the history of the brewing industry, and that's in addition to innumerable academic papers, book chapters, and other things on business and railway history. He's been chairman and president of the Business Archives Council, president of the Association of Business Historians, editor of the Journal of Transport History, and an advisor to government and select committees on railway and transport matters, amongst other things. Tonight, we have a real treat. Terry is going to take us through, from his perspective, railway history's changing landscape, a personal view. So it's my huge pleasure to introduce Professor Terry Gourvish. Terry, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. What I'm going to try and do in this talk is to explore how the nature of railway history has changed over time in terms of research and writing. And because it's all I know, really, I'll link it to my own personal experience as being a railway historian and take it on a decade by decade basis from the 1950s. So we'll start with the 1950s. It's a nice little branch line, which were quite popular then. And looking at the 1950s world of railway writing, this was the early period of nationalised railways, and people who were writing about the railways were somewhat nostalgic in nature, and they were really harking back to what they called the heyday of private sector railways, when the railways were privately owned in the 19th century into the 20th century with the Big Four. And there was a dominance, I think, of the narrative approach, I think it would be fair to say, among most people who wrote on railways at the time. Well, I started writing on railways in the 1950s, but I was still at school, actually. But a lesser known work of mine, one that David somehow missed out, actually, was an essay I wrote, a long essay on the Brecon and Merthyr Railway, which was a puzzle to everybody because I'd never been to Brecon, I'd never been to Merthyr, and I lived in Leicester at the time. And for the life of me, I can't remember why I wrote it, actually, but I think, and I wasn't the only one, I think. I was actually impressed by some of the publishers who were beginning to interest a wider public on railway history. And there was a very good Oakwood Press book on the Brecon and Merthyr Railway, written by Derek Barry, who I think worked in British Rail. And along with the Oakwood Press, along with Ian Allen, were dominating railway history publishing at the time, and indeed railway enthusiast publishing. And I think that's what got me interested in trying to write something myself. The books at the time of Oakwood Press, Ian Allen, I think it's fair to say, were very keen on the promotion, construction, and above all, the operation of the railways, with plenty of nostalgic celebrations of steam locomotives, which had additional force because this technology was beginning to be threatened by electric and diesel alternatives. And I've mentioned a few. I've mentioned Alfred Rimmer, Cromford and High Peak Railways being one that's usually thought to be a good example of its kind. And then among the Ian Allen books, Cecil J. Allen's Great Eastern of 1955, And then his son wrote, Geoffrey Freeman Allen wrote British Railways Today and Tomorrow, which is still useful for anybody wanting to know about the modernisation plan and its aspirations. I'm sorry, I've been a bit disconcerted because a black cat has just jumped on the wall outside where I'm talking, and I've never seen it before, and it looks like it's lost, but I'll carry on regardless. So I should mention other people who wrote in the 50s, Hamilton Ellis, O.S. Knott, Michael Robbins, LTC Rolt, George Dow, and they dominated it. And I think it could be fair to say it was a narrative form. Now, John Kelly was quite rude about all this stuff. He was given a whole lot of books to review for Victorian studies, a whole lot of railway books, but incredibly rude about them. He said, I've read these books, I find them, and I'm quoting, tedious in the extreme. Almost any reminiscence or trivial detail can be taken as self-justifying. He attacked what he found to be the self-indulgence in the writing, apparent in the lengthy digressions to describe railway accidents. Sorry, Mike, about that, but that's what he says. The cosy reminiscences, the pages of minutiae concerning individual locomotives, the reconstructed footplate journeys. Now, I thought this was rather unfair coming from an academic historian of the railways, because it neglected the value of the wealth of detail that these writers unearthed, and that acted as a kind of pathway for academics who weren't familiar with the industry in its technical sense. Where I think Kellett was right was that nearly all these books lacked an index, which is incredibly frustrating for a researcher, that in order to try and find something in one of these books which didn't have an index, it's really very frustrating. So in that they were right. Well, turning still in the 1950s, but turning to the academic world, such as it was at the time, there weren't so many universities at this time. The academics writing on the railways in the universities and colleges were writing on the promotion, investment and construction period in the main, rather than in operation, and looking at the 19th century in particular. And this was difficult because some of the essential building blocks for doing this didn't exist. We did have the British Transport Historical Records Office in Porchester Road and in York and in Edinburgh that operated from 1951 to 1975. And they had quite a lot of stuff on subscription lists, but the very voluminous, hugely voluminous shareholders registers were thought not to exist at the time. I have to say that 40 years later, I saw some of these in a building in King's Cross, which was going to be demolished to make way for HS1. But very few of these things actually found their way into archives. I think there's some Great Western stuff in Trowbridge. So people like Seymour Broadbridge, Harold Pollins and Malcolm Reed, who wrote about investment and ownership of the railways in the 19th century, had to rely largely on subscription lists, which are just promises to invest in shares, and not a proper measure of people who actually were left with the shares and were long-term investors. But there was quite a lot of research at that time on this material. In Leicester, we had Jack Simmons, and Jack Simmons, I can't really underestimate the stuff that he overestimates, his work, first of all in founding with Michael Robbins the Journal of Transport History, but also encouraging research more widely on railways, not just about the railways themselves, but their impact more broadly on architecture, the landscape, tourism, the arts, politics, etc. There's a very good festschrift by Evans and Goff on Jack's work, which will tell you more about it if you're not familiar with it. Many of you are. Well, now we come to the 1960s. This is me in the 1960s, I think, because I'm embarrassed to say I was collecting railway memorabilia, including railway locomotive number plates, of which here are two I've still got, both for the Great Western, which seemed to be more liberal in letting you buy them cheaply. But anyway, on to the 1960s. And this is Grand Central Station in New York, is just illustrating the fact that American historians were incredibly influential in the 1960s in influencing British railway historians. And I'm sure you know about this, but I'll go through what they did. They invented something very, always good to invent something if you're trying to do something different. What they called econometric history, or cliometrics, as it was also called. Bob Fogel and Albert Fishlow were the writers who were trying to challenge or measure an assumed truth in American economic history. That is that the railroads were incredibly important to economic growth, and without them, American economic growth would have been held back significantly. And they did so by means, or Fogel did, by means of a counterfactual. He said, well, we can measure this by, let's pretend the railroads never existed. Could we have carried the same amount of freight and the same amount of passengers, although the Americans tended to be more interested in freight? Could they have carried the same amount of freight? Would it have cost more? How would this have an impact on economic growth? How much economic growth would have been sacrificed if they would have to have used roads and canals? Now, this methodology and its results tended to be challenged in detail, but the innovative approach did stimulate a generation of scholars, young scholars then, to measure the impact of railways on our economic growth. So Gary Hawke, who came from New Zealand, went to Oxford, did a calculation similar to Fogel's on the railways of England and Wales. The reason he didn't include Scotland was that Ray Vamplew in Edinburgh was already doing a PhD on a similar measure of assessing the impact on Scottish railways. Meanwhile, Malcolm Reed, also from Oxford, was working on a much more computer-driven model of railway investment with the limited data they had. It was getting better in the 1960s because people like Brian Mitchell and George Kenwood and Charles Feinstein were producing volumes on statistical material relating to railways, which did help, provided again a benchmark. Well, I did write on this period rather later when I did this little book on railways and the British economy, and we'll come on to that later. But while we're still in the 60s, we shouldn't forget, especially as there's some industrial disputes going on at the moment on the railways, that Philip Bagwell was active in the 1960s writing on railway labour, in particular a history of the NUR, the first volume published in 1963. And they were active in the period, as indeed were Philip Bagwell and Henry Parris writing about the political influence of the railway interest in Parliament. And then finally, Jim Dias and John Kellett were writing on the urban impact of railways on Victorian cities. So I don't want to exaggerate the American thing influenced me in some ways, but it was there was other quite fruitful areas of research going on at the same time. So I, in the 60s, as David mentioned earlier, did a PhD on Mark Hewish, first general manager of the London North Western Railway. In fact, I was influenced by the Americans also, because I had read an important article by Alfred D. Chandler at the time, showing that American railroad executives, chief executives, were considered by him to be very important in revolutionizing corporate management generally in the United States. And I read that, I wrote to him, he encouraged me as a very, I wasn't even, I don't know how old I was at the time, can't have been more than 21, and wrote me a very, very supportive letter encouraging me to take this on. And I did in that book eventually published. So I've mentioned the non-American initiatives. I skipped ahead here, that it was a fertile period for railway historiography generally, with Philip Bagwell and railway labour, the railway interest, and I've already discussed that. Right, on to the 1970s, Crisis and Change. This is the APT on a trial run at the end of the 1970s. The 1970s were important because the archival service to railway historians got better. The British Transport Historical Records offices, I don't know how many people are still alive like me who actually went there. They were closed in 1975, so it's a long time ago. Those of us who worked there found that you were never sure what to expect, because they, if they didn't like the look of you, they decided they wouldn't let you see any material. So it was run on a non-professional basis, I think it's fair to say. And in 1975, their material was transferred to the National Archives at Kew and the Scottish Record Office in Edinburgh. And I think things got, therefore, much better. Similarly, in the 1970s, we had a better transport statistics database when Dennis Mumby's book was rather tragically published in 1978, because Dennis died in an accident in Turkey on an archaeological visit. And it was left to somebody called Watson to make sure that his material came out, and provided a huge amount, very carefully described statistical data relating to all transport. Finally, Jack Simmons was still active in the 1970s. He managed to persuade, it was very difficult if you'd written a PhD at this time in the 60s and 70s to get your work published as a book. But he persuaded Leicester University Press to support a railway monograph series. And it helped a lot of us, actually. There was Geoffrey Alderman's book on the railway interest, my book on Hewish. Rob Irvin wrote, I'd say, a model corporate history of the Northeastern Railway. And then finally, Jack wrote some volumes on the railway in England and Wales. So Jack really did help younger scholars get their books published at a time when it was very difficult to do so. So returning now to the 1970s, the research agenda, there was quite a lot of work on corporate history, politics and innovation associated with the names Peter Kane, Jeff Channon and Rob Irvin. This was exploring corporate activity in relation to such things as cartelization, regulation, competition, and efforts to subvert competition in the railway industry. I did something on more work on railway management. I wrote on chief executives, and I was quite interested in the time on the British robber barons, as I called them, Edward Watkin and James Starts Forbes, that were competing with each other in the railways in London and Kent. But I couldn't find a publisher. I was writing on this, and it was left to Hodgkins later to do a very good, much better than I would have done, biography of Watkin. And then, helping the research agenda, the Economic History Society agreed to create a subgroup of the society as a transport history group. This was largely due to the efforts of Theo Barker, who was the secretary of the Economic History Society at the time. And it was created in 1974. It didn't last very long, but it had a membership of about 70 at its height. And it tried to do something that was then novel, and that was to encourage the interchange among a broader church of transport historians, professional and amateur. This was much the same way as Keith Harkett did with archives, with his A2SN. I know Keith is in the audience, can't see him, but I know he's there. So this was an attempt to encourage that interchange and to try and find out what the non-academic historians, from my perspective, were discussing and finding interesting. We had a number of joint conferences, and it really was quite a fertile time. However, I have to put on my critical hat now, because I'm an old fart, really. And I think the younger ones in the audience among you would say, well, surely some of this stuff, it's a bit rubbish, isn't it? And I've called it the Gourvish-Irvine approach to railway management. I think from today's standpoint, people would say this was very one-dimensional. It tended to be assumed hierarchical control by chief executives and executive chairmen and directors. And it assumed that these people were the business, were the company, and would set the strategy, etc. And after 40 years of management research, I think we'd now put more emphasis on the limitations of an individual's impact within a large company, on mediation effects, on interactions between several actors, etc., etc. David Turner's work on the London and South Western Railway avoids this defect, I think. And so incidentally, I thought, did Jeff Channon's revealing piece on why the Midland Railway decided to build an extension to London, published much earlier, but was actually quite novel in challenging this sort of narrative. But the most important thing of the 1970s I've left till last, and that is an enduring research interest was created, and this was the debate, quite fierce in some people's minds, about how well managed the railways were in the late 19th century, particularly after 1870, and why profits fell and whether management was to blame. And it reached an audience via Derek Allcroft's book on railways, British Railways in Transition. I've called it an innocuous little book. I think somebody said that once in a review, because it's quite tiny. It's a small book. It's a sort of A5 size, I think. And this was a book, Derek Allcroft was best known at the time for writing textbooks, economic history textbooks, which made us all jealous because they sold in their hundreds at the time and made him quite a lot of money. And he bought a condo in Lanzarote, I think, with the proceeds. But Derek wrote a book that surveyed what he called the British railway problem, the economic problems of the railways after 1914. But most railway historians just focused on the first 26 pages of this book, which were on the period before 1914, which was not what Derek was really about. And and it stirred up a hornet's nest, because in summarizing, he was a very good writer, was Derek, and summarizing the period before 1914, went on to incense a lot of people who'd spent their life researching the railways. This was, of course, Derek's first book on the railways. People like Harold Pollins, Rob Irvin, Peter Kane, and I'm afraid me as well. So what was the problem, according to Derek? Well, Derek said the railways were overcapitalized after 1870, and that was why they failed. And there was a failure of management because the managers didn't keep a brake on further investment in the railways. And it was really typical of the failure of Victorian entrepreneurs generally. And that was, I think, what he encouraged as a debate. Well, I went back to what I argued at the time. I didn't agree with Derek at the time. Were the railways overcapitalized? Well, possibly they were, but was this responsible for the falling profits was another matter, and was there a management failure was another matter. And I found several factors had an impact on profitability and not merely overcapitalization. One of the issues that railways faced in the late 19th century was the common belief put about by the legal profession as well as others, was that the railways were bound by common carrier regulation. That is, that all traffic offered to them had to be accepted, whether it was profitable or not. I'm not sure it was ever challenged, but certainly most railway managers felt that was their duty. Secondly, it is true that the railway management spent a lot of time building more branch lines at the time, investing in more marginal lines and duplicate lines. Insofar as that was a feature, I would say it didn't really add significantly to the capital stock that existed in 1870. But nevertheless, there was a lot of management time given to trying to ward off competition through duplicate lines. But another factor was the heightened regulation in the consumer's interest, pricing, safety, etc. This did constrain railway management's freedom to charge, and this was made even more acute by the fact that people talked about the railway interest being strong in Parliament, but from the 1880s, the industrial interest was very strong, and heavy industry MPs were very effective and encouraged legislation in the 1890s that put a ceiling on the right to price high. And finally, we shouldn't forget in this period that there was effective competition for some of railways' most lucrative flows. For example, coal traffic from the northeast to the London market. There was effective competition from coastal shipping. People like John Armstrong made that very clear in his research. So that was the 70s. And we're now at the 1980s when we were busy rolling back the public sector. This is Maggie waving a train. You can just see to the left of her head, to the right of her head, Bob Reid One, who was chairman of British Rail at the time. This is in 1984. She'd been to see the coalfields and met the police who were fighting the miners at the time. I believe this was somewhere in the NRM. I don't know, in the National Railway Museum, but I'm not sure. But allegedly she was waving off a replica of the rocket, but I don't know if that's true. Anyway, what was I doing in the 1980s? David has already told you that with Gerard Turnbull, we shared the editorship of the Journal of Transport History. We failed in our aspirations, I'm afraid. It was left to more people more recently to do what we failed to do. We wanted the railways to be more multimodal, the journal to be more multimodal. We wanted it to have more international articles. We wanted more comparative research work in the articles. And people kept sending us in material on British railways, not on the other modes, and certainly not international. So we did fail in encouraging the journal to become more dynamic, but others have came on afterwards. And the other thing I did in the 1980s was to write a history of British Rail from 1948 to 73. This is the cover of it. Well, why on earth was it commissioned? Because Peter Parker asked me to write it. Why on earth did he do it? Well, I think the first answer is that there was the 1980s saw quite a virulent attack, especially among academic economists, on the public sector, of which the railways were part, that the public sector was always inefficient and inferior to the private sector in relation to management, cost control, investment appraisal, project management, you name it. And people like John Redwood, Alan Walters were very vocal on this. And Richard Pryke and John Dodgson's book called The Railway Problem in 1975 was very important because it gave evidence. It was a pretty period of crisis for railway management, gave them some ammunition for that belief. And secondly, I think the Me Too effect. The chairman of nationalised industries met in a thing called the Chairman's Group. And Peter Parker was sick and tired of the chairman of the Electricity and the Coal Board boasting that they had got some really super historians doing work, writing commissioned histories. And Peter Parker thought, gosh, I'd better do it as well then. And he did. Unfortunately, he chose me, so maybe they were unlucky. Right. Well, I don't want to summarize. I want to race through this about what the book did. And some of you have read it, I'm sure. But it was looking at nationalised industries to the 1973, and at that time and before 1980, I would say, nationalised industries exhibited all the problems of working as a manager in the public sector. That you had intrusive interference from government ministers, from MPs, from the civil service. It was quite pervasive and often capricious, unexpected sometimes, on pricing, pay, investment, service levels, you name it. It was incredibly frustrating for managers, I think. So this was the difficulty. And Bob Reed was chairman when I published the book, and he wrote a foreword to the book which said, well, of course, British Rail isn't like that now, and it certainly wasn't in the 1980s, but because they were beginning to meet financial targets and had introduced sector management. But certainly my book explored an earlier period. It wasn't the last word on the subject, because I think those of you may know I wasn't allowed access inside a 30-year rule by the Treasury and the Department for Transport. And so I couldn't do that. And indeed, Charles Loft's book on the bit which deals with the Beeching period, government, the railways and the modernisation of Britain, has the advantage over me that he was able to read material I never read in writing that book. Of course, you'll have to, I'm sure you've got your views on whether we came to the similar conclusions and where we differed. Well, then on to the 1990s, not rolling back the public sector, but roll over Beethoven, because this is the last train that British Rail ran. Technically, you have to, it's the last loaded BRB-owned train to start a mainline journey within Britain. 23:39 hours on the 21st of November 1997. And privatization dominated this decade, and we were writing in it. I wasn't doing much, as Colin Duvall will tell you, because in the 1990s, while I was busy doing something else, Colin Duvall was appointed to be the first director of the Institute of Railway Studies at York, an incredibly important innovation of York University and the National Railway Museum. And under, it says here, I don't want him to go red in the face, but under the creative and energetic leadership of Colin Duvall, they spawned a whole lot of creative stuff in research, and a large and more to the point, their legacy was a large number of students who enjoyed this stimulating environment, because you had economies of scale here in students. So that was one of the things that was certainly to be welcomed in the 1990s. And railway privatization and its impact was dominating and upsetting John Wellesby. I've called it John Wellesby's beef. What was John Wellesby's beef? You'll have to ask yourself, why was John Wellesby the only chairman of British Rail not to receive a knighthood? And the answer is that he opposed railway privatization. When forced into a corner, he said, well, okay, I'm happy with it, providing you create something like BRB PLC, but that was not what the government wanted. And he then approached me after the event and said, would I write a history about how we got from 1974 and how British Rail improved itself, only to find, as it was on the brink of improving further, that it was to be broken up into pieces and privatized, with the public sector, of course, still holding the purse strings in some important So I wrote this volume too. I didn't write it, of course. I kind of drafted it with the help of Mike Anson, who did the lines work and much of the research. I'm very grateful to Mike, and indeed one or two other researchers who helped me on a limited basis. This, I think, is the book I enjoyed most writing. I really did. I love writing this book. Maybe it shows. Some people have said it's my best book. I'm not sure about that, but I enjoyed it probably the most in writing it. What were the main features? It dealt with the last 20 years of nationalised railways, sector management, dividing the British Rail into businesses to try and sharpen management focus, reducing the subsidy. Read one Handel Thatcher, because she set targets, her government set targets, he met them and reduced the subsidy. And that was good as far as the Conservative government of the period were concerned. On the other hand, it was not without adversarial elements. The Serpell report of 1983 identified further opportunities for reducing railway costs, particularly in the engineering areas. And that was something that we've still to wrestle with, I think. But of course, disconcerted railway commentators because all they did was focus on the maps in the Serpell report, which threatened to reduce, or so it was seen, to reduce the railways to a skeletal network of hardly any route miles. And that wasn't what David Serpell was really about. But unfortunately, the media fixing on that meant that people forgot that he was making substantial contributions to this pressing problem, still pressing, of how on earth do we contain railway costs, particularly in project management. And then there was the downside right at the end of the 80s, into the 90s, the Clapham accident of 1989 and safety, because this was a huge shock to the system, as indeed were the further accidents at Purley and Belgrove, and a decade later, Southall, Ladbroke Grove and Hatfield, raising the question whether the search for more economic operating was putting safety at risk. Well, some of you know more about this than I do. Human error, I'm sure, was a factor in some of these accidents, but human error can be encouraged by default in certain environments. And I think the search for efficiency did have its downside and was really a chastening experience for Bob Reid 1, I'm sure, and indeed for others that followed. So here are the hypotheses that emerged in this book. Were the railways better managed in 1994 than in 1979? I would say, I think so. On the other hand, Bob Reid was lucky because there was a long upswing in the economic upswing in the 1980s, which helped the railways to perform better. And it was a pity that in the 90s we had a downswing and economic depression for a while, which threw that into relief. How important are general economic conditions? I think they're quite important, as I say. They certainly, when people say how marvellous Bob Reid 1 was, you have to bear that in mind. Separating the economic railway and the social railway, I know Barbara Castle was fundamental in creating this dichotomy that we should run certain railway services for social reasons and others expect railways to break even or make a return. But the public service obligation, PSO, creating that in this period, I think did this with much more sophistication. Did rationalisation compromise safety? I think possibly. And was anything lost in this period? I think the old railway culture was lost, what Gerald Fiennes called the Order of Benedictines, somewhat ominously, what Cliff Rose used to call Mother Railway. The Mother Railway was, I think, sacrificed to a more sort of business school approach to running the railways. And some loyalty and pride began to be lost. And of course, this period also saw an assault on the rail unions, which also acted to attack the railway culture of the period. I'll come on to that in a minute. I forgot to mention people who I wasn't the only one writing about railways that you would think from what I've said that I was, but it's what I know. But I really should say there's some important historians writing on other topics in the 1990s. Gerald Crompton, particularly active at this time, writing about the Big Four. Di Drummond, writing about railway labour and the workshops and crew. Colin Devell, writing on a series of things, especially on public presentation of railway history. And Roy Edwards, encouraging research on freight and the railway clearinghouse, often neglected, more neglected, I think, by the British than American scholars, who I think they talk more about freight. But Roy did a lot to encourage us to do more research on freight. So it was a very fertile period, the 1990s. Now we come to the 21st century. I'm running out of time. I was writing a history of the Britain and the Channel Tunnel, which David forgot to mention. David, black market for not mentioning it. Is it railway history? Well, I would say it is. And then a history of the Strategic Rail Authority, which I probably should never have written. Far too early to be writing about that. They're the books. Nobody bought them, so don't worry, but I think people have used them from time to time. The Channel Tunnel, I said this illustrates, I think, the weakness of near contemporary history. I was writing it, and I badly wanted to take it up to at least to the 1994 when it opened, and beyond if I could, because I published it in 2006. But it was probably a mistake to write it at the time. But the Cabinet Office wanted a history of it. So who was I to say no? It paid my salary for 3 years. What it says, it's really about how governments try to cope with a mega project. Can governments actually, build things, nuclear power stations, big projects? And the answer is not always, and sometimes going well over budget. And here, I think I came to the conclusion that it would never have occurred, because since Napoleon, people were trying to build the Channel Tunnel at various periods, but it lacked a champion to drive it forward. And at last, we did have champions within government, like Nicholas Ridley. We had Alistair Morton at Eurotunnel. We had people actually driving it forward, and some key civil servants were obviously behind the scenes. But my book actually did highlight that you needed that. You needed champions to drive it forward. The other thing is, it was welcomed by Margaret Thatcher and others on the right of politics, because it was a private scheme. It wasn't, as was intended in earlier schemes, it wasn't a publicly funded scheme. But in fact, it was really, because the public purse put in £7 billion in making it happen, 3 billion to support construction. Oh no, 4 billion I think it was, to support construction, and 3 billion as a subsidy to what became High Speed 1. Was it a good thing or a bad thing? Well, there have been many knockers, and people have written books. People like David Middleton have said it was a huge mistake, should never have been built. I think that's a mistake. I think it was, on the whole, a good thing. I know some people lost their money, bought shares in it, and the shares fell in value. But I think on the whole, it was a good thing. The other thing, it showed how dreadful we all were at forecasting, something we're still very bad at in forecasting mega projects, especially passenger numbers. We were way short on that. And train load freight. We're going to have a huge amount of train load freight. We had a lot of shuttle freight transport, but nothing like the train load freight that we should have had. And then coming to the privatized railway period, I should never have written this. It was too early to assess the Strategic Rail Authority. When my book was published, it was given to the outgoing, because the Strategic Rail Authority was wound up by the government, by Alistair Darling, I think, at the time. And the outgoing chairman was Richard Bowker. He was presented with a copy of my book, and somebody gleefully told me, throw it straight in the waste paper bin without actually opening it. So I don't think he liked what I said about the Strategic Rail Authority. He thought it was a tragedy. So he was an interested party, a tragedy that it was wound up. I thought actually it was time it was wound up. It lacked teeth, and it really had to go. Once Alistair Morton, who was Bowker's predecessor, had his demands for a higher investment budget rejected, the writing was on the wall. And after Hadfield, there were far more things on the agenda. The government reasserted firmer control. I think it created some achievements it certainly refined franchising, the way we franchise, though it's still not right, and some would argue we shouldn't franchise at all. So it had some achievements, but I think it should have been wound up. But once again, it was not just about me. And some of you, I'm sure, are annoyed because I should have mentioned all the things that were done that I didn't do. That 1870, 1914 was revisited, that Mark Casson did an amazing book, Imagining a Rational Rail Network, published in 2009. Really great stuff from Mark. He and I have got something in common. We were both train spotters when at school in Leicester in the 1950s. Nick Crafts, probably one of our leading, certainly probably our most leading economic historian of the modern period. He entered the lists on this, what we might call the Aldcroft issue, with the benefit of some very bright econometric historians like Tim Loynig, David Chambers, Abhay Malatu, and they revisited the period and said that profits were low, productivity was low, and there was managerial failure. Where they differed from me is they said it wasn't that regulation was too effective. They said it was because it wasn't effective enough. I mentioned John Dodgson because these people didn't have really a feel for the industry. And John Dodgson is a transport economist and historian of long standing, of Pryke and Dodgson fame, found errors in the way they calculated productivity, which they conceded in Economic History Review in 2011. And in fact, Dodgson's recalculation painted a much more optimistic picture of productivity growth in the industry than the Crafts team actually did. Well, then we had some accounting. Can I go on for a bit longer? I don't know where David is. David, can I have another 5 minutes?
Yeah, that's fine, Terry.
I promise I'll be quick. Okay, so accounting history. Accountants, historical accountants got very interested in railway history. People like Tony Arnold and McCartney were busy in the 21st century, and they were sort of revisiting things like the 1845 railway mania and things like that, and very interesting stuff. And Jean Shaw at Manchester Business School and Gerald Crompton and Robert Dew were doing a lot of good stuff on criticising the way privatisation was working, especially franchising. And that was a fruitful collaboration, really, between economic historians and accountants. Then in the 2000s, female writers of railways, we'd always had women writing about railways, but Di Drummond, of course, notably in the 1990s. But there were more of them in the 2000s. Helena Wojciak, who was a guard in the industry, wrote a personal account about women trying to progress in this male environment, writing on passenger services, and female academics. Quite a lot of them, actually, but the ones that I've just mentioned here, I can't mention them all. Janet Rutherford and her team writing on women as often forgotten in the 19th and early 20th century. Women were corporate investors, and they supported railway companies by investing in them long term, and they did a lot of work counting this up. There was also new biographies and autobiographies. David Hodgson Hodgkins wrote the book I failed to write on Edward Watkin, and did so in an incredibly systematic. I think he read everything there is to know about, read everything there is to read about Edward Watkin. And it's a superb book. But there were also others, Terry Jackson and Ernest Lemon, and also some autobiographies. Peter Rayner, who was sacked because he wouldn't accept sector management. Graham Zeitling, who worked for Freightliner. Really insightful stuff on freight management, so little written about. And Adrian Shooter, I won't say much about Adrian because he just goes on and on writing books about himself. He's written published 2 autobiographies recently. What I would say is if you want to know about Chiltern Rail, you should read an earlier work by Hugh Jones, which is, I think, less self-centered than Adrian's work. And then Christian Warmar. Why Christian and I have known each other for quite a long time. I have to say, as we're finishing up, that pretty well, that Christian invited me to his launch of his British Rail book tonight. As we speak, he is launching his book in a bookshop. I think it's in, I can't remember, Crouch End or somewhere, or Kentish Town. I think it's maybe Kentish Town. But whatever our jousts, he and I, he came from a journalistic background, as you know. Whatever you say about Christian, he has made railway history and railway writing much more accessible and done so much to raise the awareness of the importance of the railways. He began, as you know, writing articles for The Independent, saying how awful the privatization process was. But he went on to write a whole series of books on everything from, I don't know, stagecoach buses to the Trans-Siberian Railway. So really good stuff, Christian. I wonder, I don't want to review his book, David, but I hope one or two of you will in the audience. So now we come on, I think, to the 2010s and beyond. This is an image from the Londonist. I have to mention that because I haven't quite asked them for permission, of one of the first trains going through the central section of the Crossrail system. And I was writing a book on Dolphin Square after 2010. You don't want to know about that. What we have now, and you can argue about this in discussion, I think we're now in the postmodernist stage here of Turner, Asbestos, Major, Betts and Dunn. And many of you that are in the audience who I'm afraid I didn't mention. And I think that, you know, we were following a narrative. A lot of you could say my stuff's boring because I'm sort of pursuing this perceived narrative of corporate history with British Rail. And I think what today's postmodernist historians do is they study the theme from different directions in a variety of ways. David, of course, has done much to fly the flag of railway history in all its forms, but done stuff recently on marketing, freight traffic, supply chain governance, and has an article out in the current Journal of Transport History, which he didn't ask me, I assure you, he didn't ask me to plug. Mike, who's also co-organizer of this conference, of this seminar, as we all know, made railway safety an important theme and gathered in a wide audience here to work on railway work, life and death, this major project of his. He's done other things too, but again, wonderful stuff. And Susan Major at York, Oliver Betts at York, studying women in warfare, Victorian excursions, railways and culture, the slavery connection and its connection to railway investment and promotion. And then I want to end with Tim Dunn, whose infectious enthusiasm for all things railway, including not only architecture, but the secrets of the underground the history of viaducts, and even model villages, though I don't think the model villages have a railway in them, but they ought to. You know, these people are taking research forward and encouraging. They are going to provide, I hope, the encouragement to facilitate academic visibility in publications. I do hope so. And if I'm to summarize what I'm going to finish now, and that is that what does all this show? And that shows that, and this is what I said about Mark Cusson's book, however much a subject may have been researched and chronicled, there is always room for a fresh insight. And so for those of you in the audience, my stuff is a sort of speck on the horizon now. You know, the future is yours. All I will say is I thoroughly enjoyed writing about railways. I thought it was great fun. I'm an enthusiast. I've got railway memorabilia, and I find the subject fascinating. And I found over time in my long acquaintance with it, it's a broad church with room for all and scope for lots more research. So get on with it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Terry, for that. That was really wonderful and really interesting